Hello and welcome to the Nordic Mythology Podcast. I'm Daniel Farron, co-owner of the company Horns of Odin, and I'm joined, as always, by Dr. Mathias Nordvig.
Hello, everyone. Now, this time we have a very interesting guest. It's Jonas Lau Markussen from Copenhagen. Jonas is he's got an MA in architecture and has been working as a graphic designer for about 10 years. He's very interested in the Viking Age and Nordic art, and he's been working with that for about 4 years, publishing, among others, the book The Anatomy of Viking Art, a quick guide to the style of Norse animal ornament. And he's currently also working on a book called The Anatomy of Germanic Art. Jonas, welcome so much to the podcast.
Thank you, guys. I'm excited to be here. Yeah.
I know you're a fan as well as being a guest.
I'm sorry, what?
I said you're a fan as well as now being a guest. I know we spoke
sure.
before about
I've
you
listened
listening.
to all the episodes, and you can call me a fan.
I don't get to use that word very often, so I'm going to use it where I can.
You'll have it. Yeah.
I mean, I have to say, when I first started, especially with doing the horns and trying to draw Viking art, your book was one of the first things that I came across when I guess just searching the internet for some idea on how to deconstruct this mess of knotwork that you see. And because from a pure sort of, because I have no artistic background, I fell into making horns by accident. It was kind of a hobby that turned into a career, I guess. And then wanting to do more authentic designs, I had no idea where to start. And when you look at a lot of the Viking Age art, it's so complex and so detailed that it's almost too overwhelming to know where to even start to try and learn that. And I guess your book was one of the only ones I found that kind of started out and gave some explanation, at least where to begin.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly why I created it, because I just saw this enormous hole in what was available to people, and I've had the same experience growing up in Denmark and having this partial knowledge of what was available out there, seeing bits and pieces of amazing artwork, but at the same time not really being able to fully comprehend what it actually was or what was behind the individual piece of artwork and how to connect it with, like, say, a piece of Urne style, connect that with a piece of Broa style, which is two widely different styles, and then somehow connect that across centuries of art history. And yeah, so that's why I started on the journey to kind of piece the pieces together and to make it available to everyone, basically.
Yeah.
To be able to get that knowledge.
Yeah, because I think is there 5 main art types in the Viking Age? Is that right?
Yeah, that's debatable. I have categorized 7 in the book.
Okay, because I know when Luciano was on, I think he said he thought maybe 4. Yeah, I think he kind of wasn't too sure about urns. I think he thought maybe that was a speed version of everything else, I think is how he described it.
Yeah, I think it's as Mathias often says, it's complicated. But to make it simple, I kind of chose to categorize this. It's the main agenda with the book was to make it easy to understand and to kind of make a broad strokes image of the style periods and how they connected together. So I know there's a lot of debate going on about what is each style and what it's about and how it's presented and what its characteristics are and all that. But in my book, at least, I categorize it into seven
Am I
star periods. Yeah.
am I going to put you on the spot by asking you if you can name your seven? I guess it just goes so it gives people an idea of they can maybe Google it and check out the different styles because it is so wildly different. You know, when you look at probably pronouncing it completely wrong, but like Ringerike style compared to
Yeah, well,
Ern
I'm gonna
style.
butcher all the names, so don't
Um,
worry.
That's
Yeah,
why Mathias is here to make sure we get them right. But yeah, so
I mean,
biggest mouthful
most
with a
of them are
potato in my
named
mouth. So yeah, sorry.
well, most of them are named after contemporary sites, right? Ringerike and Urnes and so on. So yeah, you can pronounce those in Danish.
Yeah,
I don't
and I
think
will.
anybody would be
I will.
offended.
And be offended if you might. That's fine with me. But I'm just gonna go ahead. Yeah. So yeah. So basically, the styles in my book is from the early Viking Age, and in some ways a little before the Viking Age, is the Broer style, and then going into the Oseberg style. And yeah, let's just name them: Broer style, Oseberg, and then Bohr, Jelling style, Mammen style, Ringerike style, and Urne style. I think that was 7. Yeah. So
I think so.
then yeah. And of course, as Mathias said, they are named after uh, some more or less relevant sites. The Broer style is named after Broer in Gotland, where we have these magnificent pieces of artwork. I think there are some horse harness mounts, especially with animal heads, with some intricate animal ornaments in them, and the Oseberg style that's the one that's the most debatable about if that's even a style really, because originally I think it's meant to both contain the really define uh, have items in my description of the style, and kind of took that for granted, because we have at least or what is it? Some of the artifacts is datable, so we know that at least the artifacts are from this time period. So we can say that at least the styles that are represented on these artifacts are in fact from this time period between the Broer style and the Bohr style. So whether the style was known or used throughout Scandinavia, that may be a question, but at least in my opinion, I see a very clear through line from Broer style to Bohr style in many aspects. And then we can go into the nitty gritty and all that, but in broad strokes.
Can I just ask one question here? What do you think the point is of this might be a stupid question, but what do you think the point is of the different styles? Are we dealing with like simply just like organic developments? You have one artistic style showing up somewhere, and then people start just like riffing on that basically and going on from there, or are we dealing with individuals or groups that are trying to put their own distinguishable mark on a style? Like, do you have any suggestions, like, as to why we have these developments, basically?
Yeah, it's probably a mix of all of the above, I would say. I think you can pinpoint some examples where there might be a case of a particular person. I don't know if he's influencing the art, but at least the yelling stone would be a good example of where we can connect a historical person to a piece of artwork. He probably didn't do it himself, but at least he commissioned it.
Mm.
And the yelling stone seems to be a model of many of the Swedish stones in the late Viking Age.
The interesting thing about the Yellingstone is also that it takes the artwork that, or at least the format of the artwork that we know from manuscripts, and puts it in stone, right? Like Harold Bluetooth seems to have wanted to get a message across about now. Absolutely. The book has come, right?
Yeah, and it's clear to that it's a good example because, as you say, it's very clear that at least this stone is specifically taking inspiration from the manuscripts. But when you see the stones inspired by the yelling stone, you see some kind of development away from the manuscript, the style of the manuscripts. Because in the Swedish rune stones, you see a development of the motive itself, and in fact, the yelling stone has three sides, and on one is a depiction of Christ, and on the other one is a depiction of a great beast motive, which is some kind of lion or wolf battling a serpent or snake, and on the third you have a text, a runic text face. But it's more or less only the depiction of the great beast motive that carries through to the Swedish runestones.
Yeah, I think if I may kick in a dimension to that, I think what we're dealing with here is obviously a non-literate society, and that means that they will be handling. They're familiar with literacy to an extent, and with letters, of course, because they're carving runes. But they're treating them much differently from us, for instance, because we go to school and we're like raised with text. These people weren't raised with text; they were raised with imagery and landscape. That would be some of the things that they would be familiar with when they were like sort of like in the visual part of their mind. So I think that might be part of the reason that the beast motif is the thing that people are focusing on and carrying through, much more than this the text component, for instance. It looks like this is just, again, I'm not an expert on this subject. I'm not an art expert, but to me, it looks like when we have rune carvings on stone, it is very much a mind that is accustomed to seeing a holistic image, and composing a holistic image that has a relationship to the shape that he's using. I say he could be a she, but and also that shape, the rock itself, having some kind of relationship to the landscape it's put in. That's how I'm sort of reading these rune texts. It's not just about the text itself; it's about the entire image. And I think that that's kind of awesome, because it looks like we have like a window into what I would call an oral mind, right? An oral visual mind, rather than a reading mind, which also gives us a lot of clues to understanding a lot of the literature actually that has oral background. So yeah, that's my little thing.
So Mathias,
Yeah,
on that,
I agree. Yeah, sorry.
I was saying, so Mathias, on that, so you see a lot of the Swedish runestones are text-based, and I guess there's quite a lot of them are almost gravestone styles. You know, they've got a message for somebody who died in battle. Is it likely that the person who had that commission is able to read? And why would they not go for like an image-based one rather than a text-based, if that makes sense? Obviously, I mean, these stones are pretty. They still do have artwork within them. Even they are. You still have like the knotwork of the beasts, but there is that very clear rune sort of design around them with the with the text and the saying.
So there's a couple of things that I've noted, at least. We have those very ornate, intricate carvings where runes appear, for instance, inside of a snake form, or in context of some kind of more organic form. And so that's one style, right? One way of carving runes. And then we also have those really interesting ones that are just like text all over a surface. The one on Thun, what is it called again? I'm blanking on the name.
Yeah, me too. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, the nice big one. It's just full of text. We also have the Erland stone, which I can't remember which one, but it commemorates a chieftain who owned land in Denmark or something like that, and it has a little bit of poetry on it. That one is also just like text surface, right? And it is very obvious that, to me at least, it's very obvious that the carvers, they aren't accustomed to dealing with organizing text. And that's very different from what we see in the Yelling runestone, where they know what they're doing when they're putting the text up in these nice lines that look almost as if you just opened a book, basically. So that's what I've noted about all of this, and yeah, I just find it incredibly fascinating, because it means that I can look at what a oral mind is creating here, in terms of stories and narratives, as they're working with text as well, and slowly becoming more literate.
So that's kind of what I'm thinking, though, is would the average person be able to read the stone? Going down that text route, if you've got a stone that is one full side of text, who's the benefit for if it's mainly an illiterate?
Yeah, so let me just throw out some numbers here, because that's really interesting to consider. We have some 150 runestones from Norway, approximately, maybe between 130 and 150, as far as I remember. They are some of them are actually quite old, from the 500s. That's the case for Sweden and Denmark too, but there's actually a very low number of runestones from Norway. Denmark has 450 something, as far as I remember, somewhere in that ballpark, and Sweden has more than 3,000, if I'm not mistaken. So
sounds right.
So yeah, and in scholarship we tend to divide by the year 1000. So anything pre the year 1000 we call sort of like the era of Danish dominance when it comes to runestones, and after that the era of Swedish dominance. A lot of Swedish runestones are connected directly to Christianization in different ways. They're often announcing that somebody has become Christian, or that somebody is building a bridge for a Christian purpose. That happens a lot in Uppland. And it looks like the church was actually promoting that local magnates would build bridges to basically improve the infrastructure. And this is also actually interesting when it comes to the Yelling Stone, because it's kind of similar thing that's happening here. We have Harold Bluetooth building the Rauning Enge Bridge, which is a huge bridge across this floodplain towards the Yelling complex that he's building too. So there's a lot of things going on with that. But so the question is, like, the average person, were they able to understand these runes? And I doubt that the average person in Viking Age Scandinavia around Harold Bluetooth's time would be able to read runes. I think it is more likely after the year 1000 that the average person would be able to read runes and carve them themselves. But still, in his time, it looks like it's connected more to, individual specialists and the elite of society. It looks like with the very early rune stones that we see, the ones from the 500s, that it's a very small percentage of the population who know how to carve and read runes. But we see sort of like an explosion in the capacity to understand rune writing towards the 1300s. The interesting thing is, the interesting example is Bergen, Bruggen in Bergen in Norway, where we have thousands of little messages that people have just been sending to each other, just carving little rune messages to each other. Some are insults, some are grocery lists, all those kinds of things. So there, it looks like runes sort of like become, if Bergen at least is an example of how we could understand the development of runic script in Scandinavia in general. It looks like runes become sort of like the everyman's written language, whereas the Latin alphabet, on the other hand, is very much tied to the church and official business. And the other example of this is Codex Runicus from Denmark, which is a description of the border between Denmark and Sweden. It contains a regal list of the Danish kings. We have the Scanian law in there, and we have a little song. Right, and this is all written in runes in a book. One of the few books that are written entirely in runes from the medieval period. And this sort of suggests to me that at that point we have reached also a point where if you want something to be accessible to the average person in terms of text, writing it in runes is probably better than writing it in the Latin alphabet, because it's only those who have gone through schooling in the church institutions who are reading that alphabet. So yeah, the question is then, what does it mean to put runes on something, right? A book, sorry, not a book, a rune stone back in like Harold Bluetooth's time. And when you do that, when you put runes on a big fat stone like that, then you're basically demonstrating to everybody that you have a powerful capacity. And if you're capable of reading these runes in the middle of the 900s, right, then I'm sure people will be like, wow, this person has some sort of like initiate knowledge that only few people have, right? This is also reflected in the mythology. So
it's a show of power almost.
I think so, yeah.
Cool. So, Jonas, how much does your architecture background come into what you do now with the art? I mean, I'm more thinking, just since we got onto runestones, obviously they are kind of like a physical, tangible thing. It's not just a piece of art on a piece of paper or a flat thing. They're in some capacity like a 3D kind of monolith almost. So does the architecture play a part in that, kind of looking at them?
I think it does, and I think it's something that comes natural or is obvious to me or that I take for granted with my background in architecture, maybe, because, and I think it ties very nicely into this conversation, because they have to be understood in their context. So you have to look at they were not a poster or something. How can I say it? They were landmarks. They were not something ephemeral. They were meant to stand there and to take space and to be the space in a way. So and regarding the art on it, when Mathias was talking, I was thinking you can kind of look at them, at the motives, like in a sense like modern logos, that you have this very you might not understand the text, but at least you have a clear reference to the image. And I think the way that they are so widely used, the same motives in different ways, but the style really iterates the same kind of motives over and over and over again. It kind of tells me that everybody knew what this was about. You didn't have to translate it, or and that also ties into the way that the artwork were used in Viking Age Scandinavia and the role it played. And I'm not entirely sure how to talk about it, but at least in my understanding of it and my experience of it is that, and also maybe specifically in the way that it was used on the runestones, was to give it this kind of Scandinavian or Nordic identity. They might be Christian, absolutely, they were Christian, and they made these landmarks to make that very, very clear that they were absolutely Christian. But at the same time, they had this essential Nordic way of delivering this message.
That is 100% clear. That
in many ways, and not only in the artwork, but also in the way they were set out in the landscape.
So I just want to throw one thing in there. So the motive that you call the beast on the Yellingstone, I actually don't think it's a beast. And this is my own personal theory, based off of indications that I've been seeing in a lot of weird materials. The Nordic mythology is one portion of it. Beowulf is another. Much later Danish magic charms written down in the 1700s also seem to suggest the same motif, that it is active from maybe like the 400s, 500s, and then for the next 1,000+ years of the stag and the snake. I think that's what the beast motif actually is. And it is really interesting because it looks like this motif of the stag and the snake, or the stag and the dragon, ties into royal ideology in the Danish area. Go to Beowulf and Hrothgar's hall. It's called Herod, which means stag. That is threatened by some kind of like chthonic being that in some cases can also be a dragon. We have this in motif, as I mentioned, in magical charms, where it's just funny that you see like a stag battling a snake for some reason. It's like, how often does that happen in the Danish woods or on the heath? So there are multiple other examples. There's multiple other artworks where it looks like this is active. and I think actually that's a very sort of like a deeply rooted motif that keeps cropping up in different contexts.
So
And
what's the of that symbolism? Is it tied to sagas or is it tied to mythology or any other?
so in the mythology, we have it in the representation of the world tree, where you have the stags in the branches of the world tree, and you have the dragon beneath, and then you have an eagle above, which ties into other symbolism that's also important when it comes to regal symbolism. For instance, Odin showing up as an eagle, and the eagle being an important bird of prey for rulers in Scandinavia at large. What we're dealing with, of course, when it comes to the mythology is compounding myths and motifs and symbols. That's what the mythology usually does, right? If it rests on a 700 to 1,000-year-old tradition, we would expect to see a lot of like different symbols and motifs from different eras basically being built up together to what is now the mythology in the 13th century when it's being written down. But so that doesn't mean necessarily that, oh, just because we find this motif in say the description of the world tree Yggdrasil, that it necessarily connects to the Danish royal house or anything like that. But it could be a motif that has basically existed for so long in the culture that it makes sense to transpose it upon this. There's just simply just like seeped into the myth of the world tree. This is my personal theory on this yelling motif, because it's so it looks like it is so common. I believe we've also found, and this is actually relatively new discovery from Ripa in southern Denmark. For those who don't know, presumably the oldest town in Scandinavia, where we have trade with the English area and the northern French coast, the Netherlands, and so on. Silver coins with that motif on it too. And if I'm not mistaken, they might be from like the middle of the 700s. I can't remember exactly. But it's just incredibly interesting and fascinating to consider that this
Yeah,
is
absolutely.
such a...
And I can recall several other from that time period with antlers as animals with antlers. So it doesn't surprise me. And just to be clear, I don't have any. I actually don't have any idea of what that motive represents on the yelling stone, or what that's supposed to be. I would hesitate to call it anything at all, because I'm not sure exactly how to trace it to anything directly, at least. Also because it builds, as far as I can see, on a several century long history of artwork and art history, dating back to the 400s. So absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I was just about to ask you, from your artist perspective, whether that made sense. Being a stag. Obviously, I have no idea.
Well, me neither, and I think that's a really good point to. Because some of the things that some of the questions that I often get is that do you have any depictions of a bear? Do you have any depictions of a raven? Do you have any depictions of so and so? And I always
Is it for
hesitate
tattoos? Because
to.
I imagine you get a lot of messages about tattoos.
Yeah, a few here and there. Yeah, but that's fine. Yeah, bring them on.
So I mean,
but I don't do any. So yeah, sorry.
I would say, so stags is something I guess you never really hear much about. I mean, Mathias, you probably know better than me, but it's not something that springs to mind when you think of kind of Norse mythology. You get your bears, your wolves, dragons, but stags doesn't seem very prominent. Ravens, it's stags feels like it's one that's kind of missed out or left out. And I imagine they would have been about. You would have, especially like in England. You would have had plenty of deer.
I mean, do you hear a lot about cows or boars? Because they're present too, right? I think this might be what we as modern people are a little more fascinated with. It's a little cooler to be down with a bear or something like that than with a stag.
I like stags.
Yeah, me too.
Do they pop up? Is it quite common that they pop up in the sagas, stories, myths, that kind of thing, or are they just kind of like a mediocre animal that pops up every now and then?
I mean, they pop up here and there. At the same frequency as wolves, no. But in significant contexts, yes.
So it's not uncommon.
No, I mean, so if you think about the zoology of the world tree as it's described in Nordic mythology, I think it's very significant that we're seeing snakes at the bottom, stags in the middle, and birds of prey in the top. Right? We're told about these different animals in the poem Grimnismal, for instance, but also in Snøstorms and Zeta. There's the nidhugg, this worm or snake or whatever you want to translate that to, ormur, and other snakes down there and around the roots. And then you have the branches. You have these 4 stags. One of them is called Eikthyrnir. And a couple of others, can't remember what their names are. And then you have the eagle that sits at the top, and he sends messages down to Nidhugg, the dragon or snake in the bottom, right, by use of the squirrel Ratatoskr. And then he also has a falcon sitting between his eyes.
I love the idea of a little squirrel just being a little, got a gossip.
Yeah, but so there's a couple of things that we can say about this. It tells us that there are certain animals associated with certain planes, so to speak, in our reality. Snakes are associated with below ground. The stag seems to then be associated very firmly with the plane that we exist on as humans as well. And then you have the eagle and the falcon up top that are associated with the sky. And this association of the eagle or the falcon with the sky is so prevalent in Nordic mythology and the saga literature as well, that they show up all the time. And the best examples are, of course, when Loki has to go to Jotunheimar to screw something up or to fix what he screwed up. He turns into a falcon and flies over there, right? Odin, when he needs to escape Hnitbjörg after he has drank all the mead, he turns into an eagle and flies off, and then he's followed by another eagle. This is a very common motif. It also shows up in the sagas. Sometimes you have the premonition that 2 warriors are going to fight, and then that shows up as an eagle fighting another bird of prey, or 2 eagles fighting, or something like that. So yeah, this is very prevalent, and this tells us that in the mythology, it looks like these Scandinavians associated these different animals with different realms. Wolves, on the other hand, they're continuously always associated with outside, the outer perimeter of our existence, where everything is unsafe. So that's another thing that is important. Cows, cattle, associated with the infields. So it's a 3-dimensional image here, where you have on On the vertical axis, you have the snakes below, the stags in the middle, and the birds of prey in the top. And when it comes to the horizontal space, you have the cattle and other kinds of pastoral animals, like the goat Hadron, who provides mead for feasting warriors in Valhalla. She's at the center too, and then outside, somewhere in what is called Utangarths, in at least the Icelandic law codes, that's where you have wolves, the scary beasts. So it kind of looks like the Vikings, they weren't particularly thrilled about wolves, even though everybody nowadays is like, oh, wolves.
Yeah, that's because wolves aren't around and they're not outside your house.
Yeah,
I'm
they're
about
not, they're not eating your pastoral animals. Right?
Yeah, if there was the very much a risk of a pack of wolves eating me or my family, I would think, fuck the wolves.
Exactly. That's probably what most Vikings thought.
So Mathias, one thing I want to quickly ask and then link it back to Jonas is the dragons in Norse mythology, they always tend to come across as quite snake-like, and in the artwork they always come across as snakes. I never really see dragons with wings in any artwork. And obviously, when Sigurd kills the dragon, he kills it by it slithering across his sword. So, how do we ever get kind of like flying dragons? Because obviously, to us now, dragons are these big fire-breathing, beasts of the sky. It's very clear what a dragon is now in modern day. So I wanted to kind of ask you to clear that, but then also link it back to Jonas in how that comes across and why it's the way it is in the artwork.
So it's pretty simple with the so-called dragons. Most of them are snakes or worms. That's the word that's used. Ormur. For instance,
it's cool, though, is it? Being killed by a worm.
Right. So we get this earthworm kind of like idea.
All I can think of is Earthworm Jim now.
Yeah,
exactly.
Got to. The spacesuit.
Yeah. So the thing is that there are flying dragons that show up here and there. For instance, at the end of the poem Björlusval, which is really interesting, we have Nidhöggr, who seems to be flying out there in the distance. And this is, of course, a very old poem. This is presumably the oldest and possibly even a pre-Christian Eddic poem. So it's from the late 900s, early 1000s. That's where scholarship tends to locate this poem in time, which means that it could very well have been composed by a pagan, right? It has a flying dragon in it. And that tells us that the idea of flying dragons has been present in Scandinavia, from the Viking Age and onwards. Now, most of those so-called dragons that we encounter in mythology or even in sagas, like the Völsunga saga, they are called worms. And to get a dragon, we seem to be using the Greek Latin loanword drekar. So there is a distinction in the Scandinavian mind at this period between a flying dragon and a not flying dragon. I don't think dragons tend to fly that much, actually, to people in that early medieval period. It comes later, but it becomes a significant image. And it's not an image that is completely non-existent either. But I think in most cases, if you asked a Viking to describe some kind of dragon-like thing, they would be describing a earth-dwelling, slithering, snake-like figure instead, which they also used, for like to symbolize ships, right? Olav Tryggvason, the Norwegian king who was responsible for bringing Christianity to Norway, is said to have had this giant ship called the Long Worm, Ormarinlangi. So, so yeah, that was the main way that they would conceptualize these so-called dragons, if you ask me.
Right. Yeah. So Jonas, just like how that comes across in in the artwork, and like I say, you never. I don't know of any piece of art where I've seen a dragon with wings.
No, I'm also thinking I don't recall seeing any dragons or animals other than birds with wings before
Mhm.
before the late Viking Age, on the verge to from Urne style to the Romanesque art. So I think that's the only depictions I can recall where we actually see wings. And but it's curious that it's the wings suddenly appear on the same animals that we would define as snakes or dragons or worms or whatever we want to call them. Um, and another thing in regards to the depiction of the animals is that they were maybe not that um, they were in some kind of flux or fluent in the way that they, especially in the Urne style, where we see the animals sometimes with two front legs and no hind legs. Sometimes they have no legs at all. Sometimes they have what appears to be four legs, um, and so on. And in the late period, we see wings on them as well, sometimes. And they're very clearly the Christian, I would say, the Christian dragon at that time. It's to
Yeah.
me at least, it seems obvious that's the. I would say that was the source of inspiration for that kind of depiction of a dragon, would be a Christian
I,
one. Yeah.
I think you're right about that, and I think it's also important to consider that we need to distinguish between sort of like a homegrown, if you can call it that, Scandinavian dragon slash snake motif, and then that more universal Christian motif that obviously refers back to the devil. there's,
Mm.
there's
But I
a
think it's curious when it comes to the Viking Age art and the art before that, and I'm not a historian, so I don't know the full picture, but it seems that that the Nordic art is developed in kind of in a constant dialogue with continental European art and British as well, but it's in a constant dialogue and drawing inspiration from European and Christian references, as well
yeah
as Roman references to begin with, of course.
yeah
But I think there's always this interplay between Christian iconography and Nordic iconography, and you can
yeah because
it's very difficult to distinguish. And I think you always end up in some kind of weird middle place or model in a way.
yeah, I mean the tradition of Nordic art is at least as it develops from around the year zero is more or less copying and redesigning motifs that comes from the south. I mean, if we look at the Brexits, they're a great example of this. But we can also look at artwork on weapons, where you compare a Roman sword that has a nice naturalistic depiction of the war god Mars on it, for instance, and then you have the Germanic copy which is basically like a stick figure. and so there's a.
It looks like I did it.
So it's like a development there.
Yeah, it does, and it's curious to see that especially when it comes to the Brexits, that the Nordic versions very clearly depict some kind of emperor figure, but in a Nordic context, and then imposing some Nordic symbolism like birds and wolves or stags and whatever you can throw at it, and I think there's these 3-figure Brexits that is interpreted as being the death of Balder, which is very clearly a derivative motive taken from a Roman coin too, depicting something entirely different. It has nothing to do with anything remotely reminiscent of the death of Balder and that myth. So it's.
Well, see, this is the interesting thing, because this begs the question: are we dealing with some really shitty artists here, or are we dealing with something else happening? I'm more inclined to think that it's something else than just like really poor artists. I think that that what is happening is that we're seeing an individual identity, that they're copying formats, but they're intentionally recreating the imagery on these Brechtiers, for instance, based off of how their minds work with visual material. That's how I would interpret it.
For people who aren't the smartest like me, what are we talking about? First of all, what are we talking about?
Sorry.
And secondly, I guess they were talking about the Nordic taking influence from Rome and doing their own interpretations of it. I assume that's kind of what I got. So I just thought maybe we could pull it back and make it a little bit clearer, so I don't look quite so.
Sorry, I started nerding out here.
It's all right. It's good to hear, but I think obviously for other people, mainly me, just to be able to understand and then look up the pieces of art, so they can put the actual thing to what we're talking about.
So the Brechtiates are these golden medallions, typically, that we find from like the 400s and into, I think the latest might be around the 600s. Can't really remember, but it actually in a relatively short period of time, they look like they are copies of medallions that the Roman legions would wear on their armor. So what it basically seems like is that we have Germanic peoples copying a military art style that has a specific context in the Roman legions, and then using them for their own purpose.
Okay.
And
how long after the fall of Rome would that be?
But this is not so much after as in before and when it is happening. So there's also, that has some implications, right? Because the peoples who are involved with the fall of Rome are these Germanic tribes, and what we're seeing from the year zero and these first centuries after the year zero. Is Germanic mercenaries, right? People coming from the northern German area and the Scandinavian area, going to Rome, enlisting in their legions and fighting for them. And then if they survive, they go back and they bring cultural artifacts and riches and a lot of interesting things with them. And this is probably like the origin of like narratives like Sigurd the Dragon Slayer. The idea of the hero who leaves home, goes out into the world, travels around, comes back with a pot of gold after he has slayed a dragon, and so on. So this is part of the development of the art style. We have evidence of trade with Rome in southern Scandinavia, particularly in the Danish archipelagos, from the first century approximately, and Rome is incredibly influential on I would assume pretty much all aspects of life here. Everything from mythology to the artwork to when it comes to architecture as well. And this doesn't really disappear, doesn't go away, even with the fall of Rome, so to speak. Also, consider that the fall of Rome isn't actually really a fall in that sense, and it's not actually that. I think when we talk about the fall of Rome, we're like seeing like these images of these nice little Roman burning cities all over the place. That's not really what's happening. We have a split up in different ways, and in some places it's more peaceful than others, and so on. And that influence continues, right? So in the late 700s and early 800s, when Charlemagne has built his nice little Western sort of the incipient Holy Roman Empire in France and Germany, his culture is incredibly influential on Scandinavia too. Even if it's Christian, even if there's ambiguity, because there's obviously a religious problem here. I mean, it's very obvious to the Danes, especially if they're Danes at this point. We don't really know, but we may assume perhaps that there's a Danish kingdom just north of Saxony. That once Charlemagne invades Saxony in 771, and later in the 80s decides to decapitate 4,000 of them for being too heathen for him and all that stuff. This is making the Danes nervous, right? Politically, religiously, they're not particularly happy about that. But that doesn't, prevent the arts and a lot of ideological aspects too from like seeping into the north. And that's really what the basis of Scandinavian art as well, because from the very early period when these Germanic tribes were traveling around in Europe, several of them we know for a fact at this point. This has been disputed in random scholarly debates over the years, whether or not, for instance, the Goths come from Sweden and all that stuff. I think we can pretty much safely say they do at this point. There's no reason to really be discussing that. The question is how they do and a lot of other things, but yeah, they probably have their origin up here somewhere. Sorry, I'm in the US. I forgot that I'd left Scandinavia for a while. And that connection to these homelands, or whatever you want to call them, is still present, at least in the form of alliances with the rulers and chieftains and whatever they are up in Scandinavia. And we can detect those connections, those alliances, in the proliferation of art actually across Europe. So this is also, I think, an important part of the development of these styles, because it signals relationships, right? So, for instance, you have the Sutton Hoo grave in England that has some artwork that is like almost identical to what you find in Vendel in Sweden, right? And this is just freaking amazing because this tells us that there's a hot link right there. They know each other. They are familiar with one another. And in the same way, you can identify this elsewhere.
And I think that's a really important part. We all talk about the beginning of the Viking Age at the sacking of Lindisfarne, and that the connection in long before this point. So it's some ways it makes sense to talk about some kind of a beginning point at this point, but in many other ways, it simply does not make sense to begin some kind of era here, and especially when it comes to the artwork of these eras, there's a very clear through line from 450 or 400 to the 1100s. And this dialogue between European areas outside of Scandinavia is absolutely clear in the artwork made in Scandinavia. Yeah, so I think that was beautiful put by Mathias. And that's exactly what I wanted to shed a light on in this conversation, because I think we miss that often when we talk about the Viking Age, or all the beautiful examples and the popular examples from the Viking Age that we pull forward, and I really like to shed a light on this topic, because it's so much more intricate, and the connections are so much more intricate than just the year 1000. Then we became Christian in Scandinavia, and from then on the artworks were Christian, and everything before that was heathen, and that's not the case.
No, absolutely.
From already from 400 or even before, we had a very strong influence on Scandinavian art. And that's not to say that the artwork created in Scandinavian wasn't inherently Scandinavian or Norse or Nordic or whatever you want to call it, but it's in this constant dialogue and inspiration, discussion back and forth between the connections throughout Europe and beyond.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And, if we really do want to set sort of like a beginning around 793 when Lindisfarne is attacked, I think what we can say is what it begins, so to speak. What begins at that point is perhaps more Scandinavian magnate involvement in areas outside of Europe in terms of military and conquest. We don't see a lot of that before. There's a couple of indications here and there. But for instance, in the 500s, 600s, 700s, before the attack, we're not seeing a lot of Scandinavian attempts at pushing their borders south, so to speak. But that's what happens in the 800s. That's and
tell me if I'm wrong, but that's in many ways also a response to what's going on in Europe. That, as you mentioned before, that the European powers are forcing their way north, so to speak. So in many ways, that could maybe be seen as a pushback.
I think that would be the case for that kingdom that exists in the Danish area, or those kingdoms. There might be more than one at this time. I'm not sure if the kingdom in West London in Norway is necessarily focused on the same thing, or they have other agendas. I think it's fairly reasonable to suggest that the Lindisfarne attack is peoples from Norway. But we can't be certain about that. It could be people from the Danish area. Obviously, what anybody needs to understand at this point is that those nation states that we know today, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, they didn't exist back then. It was very different constructions and different identities. But that aside, it's probably peoples from the Norwegian area who are attacking Lindisfarne and definitely Iona and elsewhere in the Irish area and so on. This has also been confirmed by genetics, as we talked with Sturla about in a previous episode. Norwegians did go in that direction. That was primarily Norwegians, not only, but primarily. And in the same way, it was primarily Danes that went straight to the Danelaw. Not exclusively, but primarily. and this tells us a little bit about interests, right? The Danish kingdom or kingdoms from the beginning of the 800s and onwards, does seem to have a huge military and political interest in the English area, this is incredibly interesting because it means then that there is a centralized force there that has aspirations to become a empire itself, I guess. And yeah, as you said, so I've always been a little, I think it's a little conspiracy theory ish to think of this in terms of like a pushback against Christianity, but in some ways it is also a likely thing that's happening because, as I said, Charlemagne literally invades Saxony because, well, he wants to conquer Saxony. He's about conquering. He does this to Thuringia, to Lombardy, and a bunch of other places in that eastern central area of Europe, what is now Germany and Austria and Italy, of course. And he says when he conquers Saxony, well, this is because they're pagans, right? And that sends a signal to all the other non-Christian kingdoms out there, whether they are Slavic kingdoms in the Polish area or they are Scandinavian kingdoms in Scandinavia, right? They're like, well, maybe we should respond to that. And the Danish kingdom does respond to that, at least according to this to the source material that we have available. Widukind, the Saxon chieftain or king, whatever we want to call him. I mean, he enlists mercenaries from Denmark, and receives help from north, right? So that seems to suggest that there is a geopolitical interest in southern Scandinavia, at least, to push back against this attempt to push the border of this Frankish Empire north. And this continues. Harold Bluetooth, his conversion to Christianity and all that stuff also seems to be a response to this, probably because he got his ass kicked by the German emperor at the time. There are two versions of that story. One is the preferred Danish version, which is like, Harold Bluetooth was convinced by the German bishop Papo that he should convert to Christianity because Papo could do magic tricks. And then there's the one that the peoples further north, the Norwegians and the Swedes and the Icelanders in particular, which is the one that tells us that Harold Bluetooth got his ass kicked. And this is also because Harold Bluetooth at the time has political interest in Norway. And mind you, the Danish kings at the time are harassing the Norwegian kings in Vestlandet. The southern parts of Norway tend to be under some kind of Danish control at the time, until Harold Hardruler, actually, in the early thousands. So this is a geopolitical problem to the Norwegians that are trying to establish a North Sea empire or an Atlantic empire, which they succeed in doing in the 1100s, especially with Magnus the Good, who ends up becoming king over Denmark as well for a period, and a lot of things happening here. But what this ultimately points at is that the 800s is the beginning of a time where the Scandinavian elite is almost, it's all of a sudden very focused on establishing itself as an elite elsewhere in Europe. And this happens in Normandy, and it happens in England as well. And as I've said before, the Norman conquest of England should actually be seen, in my opinion, as an extension of that, because it does look like the Scandinavians get a leg up from the Normans. And we have at least a minimal amount of place names that are produced from Scandinavian compounds and Norman names after Norman conquest. And that's really interesting. Not a lot of people have looked into this, but it suggests an alliance here of sorts. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's what's really happening with the Viking Age. But when we look at the art and when we look at trade, what we're seeing is a period that begins way before the Viking Age of interaction between Scandinavians and these both Germanic kingdoms and also not necessarily Germanic kingdoms in what is the Roman area, basically.
So Jonas, to take it back to art, where did the Vikings kind of Viking Age styles come from? I guess because I know you've been looking into art styles pre-Viking Age, but I don't see anything that's similar to kind of like the Viking styles other than like the Celtic stuff. I guess I don't really see stuff that's very similar, kind of like really crazy knotwork. So where does it kind of come from?
Yeah, and I have a limited knowledge about that because I've been very narrowly focused on Viking Age Nordic art. So I actually lack that knowledge,
Okay.
and it's
Well,
really bugs me sometimes because, but there's as we already talked about, it points back to the idea that they were, of course, inspired by, for example, the Brexits were inspired by Roman art, and directly took these motives and put their own spin on it. So then you could ask, then where did they get this quote unquote spin or this style they added to it? And that's a good question, I'd say. Maybe it comes back to tradition, and that's where I may have a lack of knowledge because I don't know about the connection to the Celtic areas and how long or tightly they were connected, and how the art looked at, say, the 400s. I know there was absolutely a connection up until the beginning of the Viking Age, but how and when and why and I actually don't know.
There's a couple of things. Again, I'm not an expert on the art, but a couple of things that I know is that some of the gripping animals that we're seeing in the Viking Age and a little before, they look like they are inspired by the Frankish area, the art in the Frankish area, and then the monumentalism, the rune, the stones, and such, and some of the art on them does seem like it is inspired from at least the sort of like the relationship to the British Isles. And we also see, in northern England, where you're at, Daniel, we do see a distinctly Nordic art appearing, right? We have the hogback stones.
That's late, then we're in the Viking Age. But but I'm thinking, if we take it, do you know anything about, say, the 400s or the 500s and the Sutton Hoo burial, for instance? We know there was a.
Yes, so with Sutton Hoo and what we find in the Vendel area. Sorry, you cut out for a second. I lost him.
I think he's. Is he back?
Oh, there you are. There you are. So to answer this question about the connections between Sutton Hoo and the Vendel area, I think that art style, that Old English art style that we're seeing there, is inspired by the Frankish and Merovingian art. That's how I understand it, at least, but I am not at all sure. It could be something else, though. So
You're talking about the Scandinavian style here.
yeah, so I'm talking
You're
about
talking
the sort of like the development of the style that that very much mirrors what we also see in the Southern Hu. I think that is inspired by Merovingian art, but I'm not sure at all, actually.
Yeah, that I would say the same, but I heard that, read that somewhere, but I don't know, so I can't speak to that, but I would tend to agree.
And there's also a
And
Byzantine influence on the art from the 500s and onwards, I think.
yeah.
So I guess it's,
But I think the interesting thing is, to Daniel's point, that we can talk about all these sources of inspiration, but every time they are taken back to Scandinavia, there seems to be put the spin on them. It's not directly copied. It's never directly copied in that sense. Even up in the late Viking Age, where we have this very close connection with European Christian nobility, and we see these very tight, connection with gift givings, and we find all these artifacts all around Europe coming from Scandinavia. They always have this very Scandinavian style, and I don't know, but it seems to me that it is in some way a kind of Scandinavian DNA, or what you want to call it. It's and one of the things why I tend to see it that way is because many of these motives, or these ways of treating the animals, like the serpents and the interlacing patterns and what have you, are so inherently Scandinavian, and they begin somewhere around the 400s and then go all the way up to the Jonas style, where we have this more broader integration with the rest of Europe.
Yeah.
Also, identity-wise. So in this period, we have it seems to me, at least when I'm looking at the artwork and when I'm analyzing these ways of constructing artwork, that we have a very inherent Scandinavian method of approaching depiction of any kinds of motives. And of course, it develops throughout the ages, but there is some kind of Scandinavian essence to it.
Yeah, no, I agree.
That deals around the interlacing patterns and the stag motive, or what you want to call it, and the serpents and birds of prey, and these themes and characteristics.
Yeah.
That's what I was wondering. I was wondering whether it was a case of this was an art style that they just created, and it kind of came from Scandinavia. I was born there, or whether it was a case of them, looking at other pieces of artwork and then just adapting it slightly, adding to it, and then another style born from that. But
there's a couple of things that we can identify also from the tapestries from Oseberg, for instance. Like, it's really interesting. I've thought of a couple of times at least. It's really interesting that these what looks like trees, where we might even have like hanged human sacrifices in them in the depiction. They're interlaced, and that just seems like it's very deliberate. And I mean, if anything, maybe what we're dealing with the clothing in particular is that's where we would probably find, like in the textile is where we probably would find sort of perhaps a much older artistic expression in different ways. I mean, I think you're totally right when you say that there is the very distinct Scandinavian identity in the artwork. Like they might borrow stuff, they might get inspiration from the outside, but then they take it in their own direction, and there's a spiritual dimension to this that exists both pre and post conversion. I would suggest, at least, and especially with the interlacing of threads and snakes and whatever it is, basically, and that is we see this in the mythology too. We see in the use of words, symbols, and motifs in the mythology a tendency to claim that the world is interlaced in different ways. We see it in context of fates, where we have the idea of spinning and weaving, right? That shows up. But aside from that, we also have words that are attached to the Nordic gods that mean those who tie, or the bonds of presumably of the world. We have it in the world serpent as well. That seems to be holding the entire world together, right? Mm-hmm. And we have it in Loki being tied in the underworld so as to prevent Ragnarok. This is really interesting. He's tied in the underworld to prevent Ragnarok. Mm-hmm. So there are multiple ideas present in this old cultural material that we have available to us, written down in the medieval period, suggesting interlaced relationships across the board in a Scandinavian worldview, basically. So, and this is also present on the Yellingstone. If the image of Christ is any indicator, right? He's interlaced here. He's not hanging on a cross. He's interlaced in what looks to be plant material or something like that. So.
And the same thing with the stag. The same thing with the stag, with every motive, and there's so many layers to it, and I think it's of course some of the aspects that make Viking art so appealing. It's also another point is that it's extremely enigmatic the way it's executed, and these weaving patterns are laid out, and even in some of the more very Christian, like the Bamberg shrine and that stuff, they have these ways of making. Then in modern days we would make it very clear what the message is, but in this culture it seems to be a very distinct point to not reveal what the message is. And we see it throughout, and the weaving of things speak to that too in some ways. And I think you can tie it into the way Kenning's work and in the language, and there's all sorts of ways of wrapping things up in themselves.
Yeah, and
in so many ways.
Yeah, no, the bringing up Kenning.
And we could do another episode just going through all these aspects, but yeah.
No, but you're totally right though. Kennings are a great example of how you're basically entangling language and words too. And I was just instantly reminded of those parts of Havamal that talk about runes. Where Odin says that you must find runes. Where are you finding these runes? Well, that's a good question. If runes represent meaning, right? Then this could be in that interlaced style just as much as anywhere else. We know from the poem Sigdrivormál that you can find runes on the nails of the Norns, and in all kinds of funky places, on the prow of ship. So there's definitely something to that. That's you're totally right. There's always layered meaning in all of this, and there's it's almost as if the artist is commanding you to look for some kind of expression here that's not necessarily expressed at all.
Yeah, and just to make a point of it, to go back to the early eras of the art, or the early styles, we see. I think it's in the 400s too. Where we see these single animals mirrored, making out a third animal. If you understand what I'm describing, that the two animals come together and constitute a third animal face or something. So you may perceive it as a animal head at first, as a single animal head, but a closer look, you discover that there's actually two animals, and then there's three, and when you take a look at the bodies, then there are all kinds of animals intertwined in them. So you can never be sure of what you're seeing, and combine that with these very clear Odinic depictions, portraits, intermingled with the art. You have this very rhythmic, enigmatic thing, hinting at the characteristics of a Odin figure or a Loki figure. This magic being convoluted and not revealing all to you, but having infinite layers of wisdom intrinsic in him, if you just kind of know how to decipher this language or pick up the runes, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, no, it's true.
I'm more confused about Viking art than ever.
So I want to just throw one last thing in there about all of this, and this has to do with the aesthetics of modern Scandinavian art and also architecture. I forgot his name, but there's a prominent architect who has written about Scandinavia and using the interplay between light and shadow. His book is called Nightlands. For anybody who's interested, I can't remember his name for the life of me. But he argues that the Scandinavian and that doesn't matter whether or not it doesn't matter if you're in Denmark or Norway and Sweden or in the far north. What we always have is a sort of like a prominence of shadow in this the Scandinavian landscape. We have the Norwegian fjords and forests are, for instance, a good example of how there's constantly something breaking the light and introducing shadow and introducing some kind of something that is obscuring the vision. This also happens in the Danish landscape, even though it is much flatter, but we have this thicket that is present. I'm not going to sort of sit here and claim that this was the thing that people were also considering when they were making art back in the Viking Age. But it is interesting to see that there is that constant play between being able to see clearly and then having your vision obscured by the thicket that shows up in the woods, in the brushes, in the bushes, and all that stuff. in all kinds of contexts all the time in the Scandinavian landscape. I don't know if that resonates with you, Jonas, but
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think we could again take another episode just about that,
Yeah.
because I think what it reminds me of is a thing that also speaks to me about the Viking Age art and Viking Age mythology and all that, is that in contrast to maybe the more Christian myth and religion, there's this notion that dark and light is part of the it's part of life. It's integral. It's not. Yeah, you can say it's opposing forces, but there's also this notion of dark and light coming together to create new things, to create life, if you will. And on its face, you can talk about that in regards to the Asia and the Jotun and how their interplay is playing out. So yeah, just to give a short answer that yeah, I think there's definitely something to it, that this theme is also playing out in architecture and in throughout the Scandinavian identity, so to speak, and how we well, let's be honest, it's we're living this every day in the way that we have the seasons and we're living very close with the seasons. So we have it's just a part of our experience to live with the shadow and to live with the what's it called, the space in between the shadow and the light.
Yeah.
And of course you can go on about all kinds of discussions about how that plays out and how that could be interpreted and how that could be seen in architecture and art and in the mythology and all that. But I think that's very clear to me that that's integral to the Scandinavian experience, so to speak.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I mean, let's wrap this one up. Like I say, we can always do this again and speak about all the other things we could touch on.
We didn't get to nerd out about the building styles, the Trelleborg houses and all that stuff. We'll have to do that.
Yeah, let's do that.
Thank you very much for coming on. If you just want to let people know where they can find,
it's been a pleasure.
Find your book, because like I said, the book is excellent. It's certainly a good starting point for people to really try and get their heads around these different styles and get some basic understanding.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's easy. You just go to my website, jonaslaumarkussen.com, and you can read it online, or you can subscribe to my newsletter and get a PDF version of it if you like to. And so that's straightforward. And as mentioned before, there's a prequel to the book coming. I don't know when, because it's a beast to work with, but it's coming. It's in the works.
Okay.
And you can kind of, if you look at the chapters on my website about Viking Age art, there's a link to the coming chapters there as well. And it's, as I said, a work in process. So just go have a look.
Yeah, absolutely. Is your Instagram just your name as well?
Yeah, it is.
I know you put that you're working on.
Yeah, I think that's the main channel too. Yeah. The website is of course my base, and then I have Instagram as a secondary, and of course my YouTube channel.
Okay.
Where I post some tutorials and what have you.
Is that under?
So definitely check out. Sorry.
Is that under your name as well?
I think if you search for my name on YouTube, it'll pop up. But otherwise, in the bottom of my website, you'll find a link to it.
Perfect.
And I think I've also posted a couple of videos on the front page of the website. So
yeah,
just go there and you'll find
You'll
it.
find everything from
I'm sure.
there.
Yeah.
Matthias, where can people find you?
You can always find me on Instagram under my name. You can find the Nordic Mythology channel on Facebook, where I occasionally post links to our podcasts, and you can also find me on my website, NordicMythologyChannel.com, where you can read a little bit about me and also, the occasional blog or stuff like that. So yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, obviously you can find my company Hornswolding at www.hornswolding.com. You can find me personally at Daniel_Farrand1 on Instagram. Again, if you enjoy the podcast, please take a minute to look at the Patreon. We've got a bunch of cool stuff on there. We just recorded Ynglinga Saga the other day. I'm trying to learn to pronounce it. So that's a bonus episode for people who support us on Patreon. So please just take a minute to go over and have a look on there. Like I say, it really helps us. It helps us get better equipment. Takes us spotting some new lovely headphones that you guys have helped us buy.
And a microphone.
And a microphone. Yeah. All we need now is cameras, or better cameras.
That's true, yes.
Yeah, thank you to everyone, the supporters, and if you can't support us on Patreon, even if you can just take a couple of minutes to write us a review on wherever you listen to the podcast, leave us a 5-star rating. That helps us get up on the charts as well, which is always nice to see. Perfect. Well, thank you very much for listening. Thank you, Jonas, for joining.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
No problem, anytime.
Yes.
So, I'll speak to you later.